All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to Madeline Bassnett, Gary Barwin, and Tom Prime in conversation. They have also very handily, if you're wondering who is who, they very handily sat in that order from left to right. Madeline Bassnett, Gary Barwin, and Tom Prime. I'm going to introduce each one. Some feedback. Good. I'm going to introduce each one of them, and then we're going to have each sort of, writer. Gary and Tom will read from A Cemetery for Holes, and then Madeline will read from Under the Gamma Camera, and then we'll spend the rest of the hour in conversation, as the title of this event promises. So I'll start with Madeline. Madeline's the author of 2 chapbooks, Pilgrimage and Elegies, as well as a literary monograph, Women, Food Exchange, and Governance in Early Modern England. She's currently on the board of Poetry London and teaches in the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western University. And she'll be reading today from her first full-length book, Under the Gamma Camera. To her, to the right of her, from your perspective, is Gary Barwin. He's a writer, a composer, a multidisciplinary artist, the author of 21 books of poetry, fiction, and books for children. His most recent sort of individual book of poetry is the collection No TV for Woodpeckers, but he also has, it's just come out, his new and selected poems, For It Is a Pleasure and a Surprise to Breathe. He's also the author of the recent best-selling novel Yiddish for Pirates, which was a finalist for the Governors General's Award for Fiction and the Scotiabank Giller Prize. His interactive writing installation using old typewriters and guitar processors was featured in 2016-2017 at the Art Gallery of Hamilton. He's a finalist, or was a finalist, for the National Magazine Awards for Poetry. He's a 3-time recipient of Hamilton Poetry Book of the Year, and he's also received the Hamilton Arts Award for Literature and has co-won the B.P. Nicol Chapbook Award and the Cam Hunter Arts Award. He is also one of the judges of this year's CBC Poetry Prize. He also has a PhD in music composition. I'll probably ask him about that later. He's been writer-in-residence at a variety of institutions. You may know him for being writer-in-residence at Western University here a few years ago. And he's done a great deal of teaching and many other things. Finally, sitting to Gary's left, your right, is Tom Prime. Tom has an MFA in creative writing at the University of Victoria, specializing in poetry. He's a BA at Western University, and he's been published in Carousel, Ditch, Fjord's Review, The Northern Testicle, The Rusty Toque, and Vallum. His first chapbook, A Strange Hospital, was published on Proper Tales Press. His latest chapbook, Gravity, Nipple, Milk, Planet, Anthropocenesters, was published on Above Ground Press. He is, with Gary Barwin, the author of what is his first full-length collection, A Cemetery for Holes, which has just been released by Gordon Hill Press, and they're going to read from that now. So please welcome.
Thanks very much. This is great. I can actually see my illegally parked car down here. So if I have to interrupt the reading and jump there to speak, try and elicit the sympathy of the parking ticket office, or you'll know why. So we're going to read selection from this book. This is a book that we wrote collaboratively, and we'll talk a little bit later about how we wrote it collaboratively. The muse came from the sky, split open, and she came in her Daphnis robes, and on Google Docs, and bestowed us both with brilliant poetic vision, right? Yeah. Yes, Gary, whatever you say, just go ahead. Okay.
All right, this poem's called Night Wrote, Body Limbilical.
Sorry, I can't hear.
This poem is called Night Wrote, Body Limbilical.
Thank you.
Hills are antlered pronouncements of a classroom luscious in its gravel, says the Martian landscape, the board meeting, a wingless masturbation.
Is my X-Acto knife brain their X-Acto knife tongue? X-Acto knife brother asks.
Smug as a bean pod smile speaks from the bridge belly, halved in a driveway slick with ice.
If I amygdala my frontal cortex, will it sluice a neighbor's pectin?
Less Bosch and more 80s sitcom, grass eyes licks thought with liquidity.
Is it gristle? Is it mode? Is it grandpa's pure roots?
Swan burrows into its own feathers' size. Here in the ground, it is owl listening to the ground dark.
Clogged moon hovers like an abusive father whispers.
This is kind of like an old-time, like bluegrass band where people come and lean into the one mic. It's right, so quaint.
Okay, this poem is called Light Hinge. Life is cheap. There is no justice for people like me, I say to perfect, when the rain is factories and their eyes are litmus tested. Why do you crust your heart with guttered newspapers? The gutted slum bodies have formed into mud baskets, replies perfect. Drooling hulls of anti-birth shipless boat skins, I cartilaged the moldy hunter belly half eaten by perfect. Perfect, I have loved you as long as I have been ashamed. Perfect is so cruel, it has eyes of my tongueless father who I failed the moment I was raped in the slog leaves that muddy in toad heat.
Lay-cloth, squat-lit, boatskin, bone-shod summer hand, luckless goad of childhood, whipped ragged wound, tooth-chipped spinnaker, mind unfurl. So one of the things that's happening in this book, I guess it's a question of how does experience, how does trauma break apart language? In what way does language hold a certain kind of normative experience that then, if you have a non-normative experience, language itself breaks apart? And so the poems reflect that that trauma on a structural and grammatical and even syntactical level. So we can talk more about that later, perhaps.
All right, this poem is called The Wolf Man of Fergus, and it's actually a true story. I didn't know this guy directly, but he was pretty strange. He had his own shack. He lived outside the village, and he biked around and on his bike or whatever. He was pretty scary. Anyway, here it's called The Wolf Man of Fergus. Buys economy packs of panties from Bargain Mart, lives in a rape makeshift shack. A pin pokes both his eyes, drains see-through sacks. The cow pesticide can't sleep. You run until the warm trickle of cum is tissue paper clumps. When you're 13, your heart is television screened. Nobody believes you. I see a thin layer of peach fuzz. My brother fucks the next door neighbor, forces me to watch. The pubic glower, the boy's hairless chest pressed against mattress. We walk the path from Elora to Fergus. My neighbor's mother jumps. The bridge inhales her chain smoke. This town leaves its dirty needles between the couch cushions. It's okay, it says, with the face of his rape makeshift uncle. The wolf man is many men, the 6-year-old taste of opalescence, of semen, OxyContin forgetting. This town's ashamed of its children.
The taste of stars, mole on the phone, hissing like smoke, mole on the boulevard, a pipe, mole president of light, flashing in rivers. Depression is a god of gods. Does it affect trees? Moles hang onto the planet, says fish, fish, fish. Rocks are slow, they're lights. Mole is their president, say it in the water, between beef and cow. Get out of your velvet body, there is no intelligent sign.
Aquarium Adermis. The Tank is an elementary school teaching kids about the prevention of mud loss, spontaneous combustion, and homogeny. The tank's got cum stuck in the pump. Grubby little hands muddying the tank's vision. Someone said the lunchroom monitor was a pervert. The tank shat pebbly bits. The Hegelian kids ate lead-based paint and lip-blossomed miraculous symphonies which created tiny people who did this and that to one another. The tank grew padded cat feet and undulated out the door.
It's a bad translation. The baby is in the animal's body. What are the other children doing? What are the names of all your parts? Bad? What is bad? The instructions say, help their tiny souls. Get out of the door through the door. Another says, at night, there is a test.
This poem is called Worldless. In these countries, people are quartz-teethed. They sit in transport truck-shaped holiday inns and camel tongue-like eggs. There are tiny doors the underworld tongues clone, ghost-butted translucent shapes. People are barn doors are having babies are when the tongues hang off unreachable branches.
No, says car bomb, says bone fracture, says fish heart, mountain no, did not write it, took it from its glass case. My left part, right part. No, says choir and weep now. No is waiting, old green lawn, home on fire.
Mudlust. The uncreative, landless grocery crab's cloth mesh. Your dress, why does it look like a violin sounds when it's played by a saw? It is true, I was born in a water filtration plant, where the rumors smudge the air and excise the demons without magnetic wristbands, where hunters have arrived at Forever 21, where the kids are mug glint-eyed and tinsel their tongues with crushed Christmas balls, stale candy canes, and dad's benign lump.
We're in the mall, 100 fingers, put them through colander holes. If I can't have nothing, then no one can. Shining like store, so much to buy. Fabric is the story, opening eyes, shining. Milk, maybe a suitcase, rock in the food court. Pockets of fountain pennies, wish you morning. Sad burrito meme, trees on traffic islands. We're glum. When did you rise? Did you rise? 1,000 fingers.
Okay. Bone port. Unusually, the skull rings as poodle-shaped balloons, dendrites, refabricating the megapixels. Dog is unilateral, the bicameral sponge. Leathery entrails, wooden dialogue, the handkerchief, my craw, the hail of a magnetosphere, telephone in my earphone calls. If they are people, they too omni-headed halves, this my head's quartered mouth, ear lobes, jaws opened, bracketed into the screw hole, bone port in my palm. Thus the material of my thoughts is a heavily bandaged hand. My fingers constantly perform a flawless rendition of Chopin's Nocturne in E minor, the skull ring, and in November, his homeless skin a projected consciousness, the cat's hiss, the pillow of my lungs.
What bones, what dear, what dog-linked cruel's your cyst? What if I never said or knew I was, whip, ragged wound, white as the teeth on a bleached asshole, created from all the colors? Observe me through black, who lost their head. Where are the mountains which have no eyes? Why did she breathe out of holes? Will I board the white yacht? Will I sail the dark boat? A door into water, windowless, wing fingers broken. When an apple falls, I forget the tree, a hole in death, same as life. Your epitaph here.
Colquitt's Creek. I guess there's a preface for this. I used to live on the street, and I lived under a bridge, and there was a little creek in Victoria called Colquitt's Creek. It's pretty gross. I push a grocery cart in the rain, past a mall fat with Cinnabon, H&M, drum and bass, back to the unlit rat bridge, oil drip, windowless. Possessed by Benny Hinn, I preach to the aliens. The light of Christ, a dog's bite for the homeless, the shape of being raped, knives doing nothing but going through flesh, wolf grins, centipede skitters down the bathtub basin of my lower back.
We once had bodies, once loved bodies, a cemetery for holes, which by now, of course, have disappeared. This is not somewhere else, but here, a constellation searching for each other underground, an embrace, a remembrance for stories left in open air, a cemetery for eyes, legs, tongues. We once had bodies. They remember. Yep.
Hermetic. The first day of my life, I killed a bunch of cows. I was so small, the ants' little repeating noose hearts, the size of scaled Spitfire models, modeled me meticulously. I munched the glass until sailors, long since sarpedened, touched their lumpish lungs. I'm hopeful. The pink scarf, my mother, a box of staples lurk in a cathode tube. Why'd I get a jar of morons who'd night heavied? I am a plate of oranges.
And finally, we'd like to read minnows. Minnows are Wikipedia pages. A hyperlinked water night, see things, wigless and half incensed, vainglorious through the saline.
Or rather, my blood nervous seething.
Veins or stingray winglets slivering in the depths of Constemious Scion, the first bird reversed beyond the Pleiades. The end is always silence, 100 grass tips inside the head, burning.
They sleep under the exhaust pipe. I type the invalidated grains of cerebro PDF fluid cloud spill. Life, Wikipedia's, minnow flow brain huffing, breathing the welkin, amorphous spider-lipped garment.
Empyrean trauma slacks, doc, a JPEG glint, the calendric strafe, usury waves.
My timeshare Shatterhand, a furtive comet, glass nodes, gradient-like, second bird flies with the feather of the fist.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And now we have Madeline Bassnett reading from Under the Gamma Camera.
Thanks, Aaron. And I sort of began writing, and many of the poems in Under the Gamma Camera come out of breast cancer diagnosis that I had in 2014. So many of these poems kind of respond to the process of going through cancer, thinking about cancer. Not all of them, but this is a kind of overarching idea in the book. So I will read a few of these. The Secret Life of Crabs. I have found them always slightly repellent, their hiding tactics, their sideways scuttle, pincers opening and closing like grasping hands, the strange motions of their mouths, small tongues licking non-existent lips, like the mouths of villains anticipating someone's pain. Their communal ways, clambering over each other's brittle shells, the rise and fall of multitudes of legs clicking and scraping, each indistinguishable, as if replicated from one source, armored bodies stiff, mechanical. Their dim pools, their crannies and caves, the way they appear unnoticed, voraciously reproducing, sending their larvae out like scouts, looking for a ledge, a welcoming outpost, finding them now in my body. Even here, their oppressive presence, their disharmonious imposition of will. Tomorrow, the rain. Weeping at the bottom of a hill, unable to climb. Even the stairs, splitting the slope into thoughtful increments, unscalable impediments, legs unwilling to lift or push, to take my body up. It's not about pain, only terrible emptiness, the feeling that nothing lives in my bones. Tomorrow the rain will arrive, bursting through the torn sheet of a sky, closing like bed hangings, thick gray velvet sweeping across the lake, all morning listening to the roiling grumble of thunder. It's easy to say how quickly things change, the brash torrential something wiping out the waiting blankness of the day. Harder to live it, the body remembering how it was, how ungratefully able and strong. Now swaddled, head wrap and sun hat, long sleeves conceal my fragile frame from the sun. Hands cover my mouth, trying to stifle the noise, trying to find the stubbornness. The rain pelting down like gritted teeth, the insistent jab of lightning. The body rising from the bed, throwing the bed hangings aside, opening the lake. The lake's flatness staring back, wondering about the fuss, stretching as it always did, beyond the horizon. The next poem I'd like to read is a slightly longer one. It's a sonnet sequence that's called a sonnet corona. The sonnets themselves are not traditional sonnets, so you won't hear the usual meter and rhyme that you get with sonnets, but what you will hear is the thing that makes it a sonnet corona, which is that the last line of each sonnet is repeated as the first line of the following sonnet, so you'll hear that. A couple of other things I want to tell you about this poem. This is a poem that kind of thinks at the same time about jellyfish and cancer. I did a lot of reading while I was on medical leave, and one of the things I read was a book called Stung by a jellyfish biologist called Lisa Ann Gershwin, and I learned all kinds of interesting facts. So jellyfish, like cancer cells, like to proliferate. In jellyfish sort of move into areas of the ocean that are kind of dead areas. When other animals can't survive, jellyfish do really well. So they have this kind of interesting proliferation aspect to them. The other thing that's interesting about jellyfish that kind of matches with a cancer cell, of course, cancer cells are cells that don't self-destruct. Our cells are supposed to self-destruct at a certain point, and the cancer cells decide not to. And then they just keep growing. Jellyfish cells not only proliferate, but jellyfish don't really die. And this was kind of weird and fascinating. When their bodies die, they disintegrate, and their cellular DNA go back into the bottom of the ocean, and they regrow themselves as polyps that then flower back into jellyfish. So this is a poem that's kind of thinking about those types of things. A patch of immortality. What do we do with something that won't die, that merely disintegrates, jellyfish cells receding the ocean floor to start again, polyp to medusa to polyp? The immortality we long for, overcoming cell death. Imagining we could start again, last breaths folding smoothly into the first, withered cells shedding casings like moths, fibrous cocoon split and discarded, new wet body launched into the world. Worthless dust, striping the putrid sheets. But there in the center, a wriggling thing, glistening with a clear kind of jelly, cradled in its protective globe, viscous, translucent, stub of a tail nestles spine. Translucent stub of a tail nestles spine, cells curl together like soft palms. Another egg plants itself among rocks, grows a firm suctioned foot, a stem, a flower of tentacles, reaches hungry fingers into dark. Cells still replicating, clone nudged up to clone, the same face turning towards itself, the mirrored mirror narrowed to infinity's pinpoint. These tough, thoughtless buds, believing that more is better. Medusae blossoming, their flowering bodies snapped into the current, floating like small brave pods, blind and voracious, water taking them like wind. Taken through water like wind, gelatinous stomachs, silent drift through clouds of larvae and eggs, simple geometries of plankton, tentacles tirelessly trawling the driftings of slaughter. Jostling jellies weave their insatiable net, a fine fog of waste sinks softly below. As if their job was to wipe the ocean clean, rid it of the busy swirl and snatch of life. Hungry to grow and replicate, thinking only one thing is enough. Believing the ocean an empty sack, gaping to be satiated by this tide of clones, unchanging, a body in love with itself. We find it beautiful, this body in love with itself. Soft parachute bowl pulses like a heart, trails its streamers, orange on blue, rises and falls like breath. Shoulders soften, lungs expand. We could watch them for hours, seduced by the primordial world of calm and silence, rhythm and flow, jellyfish bright as comets, sharp as stars, as if ocean and sky were one. As if we too were one, bodies shedding loneliness like sweat, its long beads rolling off our backs, peeling away. A single body incorporate. How wonderful it is to be one. How wonderful it would be to be one. The lines packaging our hairless bodies would fade like pencil, open our sides to the air. Open us to each other, cells bonding like old friends, fractals in endless replication. One dividing cell beginning it all, refusing to accept apoptosis, meaning the falling of leaves or petals, as if death had grace or purpose, spreading its bright colors all over the cooling ground. Not expecting resistance, a selfish grab at eternity, ruining the careful balance, believing that more is better, the cell's close jostle of itself, itself, itself. The cell's close jostle of itself, starting somewhere inside us. Death signals thwarted, the hunger to replicate, pushes like a spade into soil. Wanting to permeate the world with its own vain face, wanting the world to love it. Purpose and grace usurped, the busy swirl and snatch of life silenced by too much growth. This life that won't die, that bloomed in my breast, a patch of immortality longing to snap itself into my currents, to fill me with just one thing. How our longings betray us, fear of death leading towards this hard lump, those teeming jellies, these things that just won't die. I'm just going to read one more poem. Mill Pond Aria. Think about flow. Remember the joy of it, pouring against paddles of wood, glittering pulse of work rhythm thudding with life. How good it is to turn, how good it is to slide across encrusted earth, to carve again a slender passage, to drip and trickle and run, to be part of the turning. Dust-dry rocks, opening mouths, washing long-forgotten backs. Everything rushing, separating, rushing and rejoining, the thrum of jubilance unleashed. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I want to start just with the fact that although these are two very different books, there's some really interesting connections between the three writers up here on the stage today. And I'd ask you to talk about that a little bit. For those of you who don't know, Tom did his undergraduate at Western, and when he was there, Madeline supervised his thesis, and that was also where you connected with Gary. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's some degree of mentorship in that relationship. So I'm wondering if you could all kind of talk a little bit about those relationships, how they've grown and developed, and how that's been reflected in your own work. Tom, do you want to start?
Oh yeah, I think when I met Gary, I think it was only his second year, and was writing these pretty plain poems about factory work, which I don't really like anymore. But he, like I feel like everybody has to start somewhere, and it's pretty straightforward, normal kind of poetry. But he taught me a lot about editing, and so obviously it's great that I met him, because we write really strange poetry, and this is not even strange compared to what we write. So
it's not exactly how I would remember it. I wouldn't have said that you wrote sort of normal poems. What I felt was as writer in residence, people brought me many things. I would say that your work was it was really raw, and it was full of, for me, I immediately saw a kind of vibrancy and edginess and willingness to explore difficult things, but also to explore language in exciting ways. So absolutely, I mentored you when we first met for the year, and Tom was one of these people who came back once a week as a writer. And so we had really a lot of interaction. But I would also say then rapidly after that, though I'm more experienced and have the gray hair or the white hair of age, for me, part of being in collaboration is what you can learn from another writer. And so it doesn't feel like it certainly doesn't feel like mentoring now. Now it's like, okay, so you'll be willing to go to places, or together we're exploring these kind of wild outreaches of language and of experience that I'm sort of excited to come along for the ride and see what we can do together. And so for me, it really expands the range of what I'm willing to do, able to do, have considered doing as a writer. So that's a very exciting space to be in.
Yeah. I think especially like this. It's much more about the traumatic experience, and I feel like in a lot of ways, I feel like you were like an ally in that experience of talking about my own trauma and my history. But nowadays, I feel like we're just trying to. We'll just do whatever happens, and it's organic, but it doesn't have to particularly mean anything. And I feel like, because it's almost like a assault on the structure of poetry and the idea the meaning making in poetry, especially our newer work.
Yeah, so we've been working once a week to collaborate still. We meet via Skype and Google Docs to continue to write other work. Maybe we should just quickly, before I know you want to get on to asking other questions, but I just going to mention about, just because Tom referred to it, so this current book, it comes out of, it starts out from Tom's sort of biographical experience of sexual trauma and homelessness. So for my role as a collaborator with that, where does it put me? That's not my experience. I've been invited into Tom's personal story, and so how do I relate to that as a collaborator, and how do we work together? It's an interesting space to be in. I mean, so like to me, as an ally, as a friend, as another writer, as somebody who can then try and relate through my own experiences of emotional difficulty or trauma in other ways, and so how we can find a place of dialogue about that. And so it changes how things actually get written. But that's interesting, that because usually it's the reader and the writer have this sharing of experience, and you connect to what you read and how that relates to you. So this is an actual process of us writing together through a shared different experiences, but sort of overlapping and varied roles as we write together.
Madeline, could you
Yeah, I had the great pleasure of supervising Tom's honors thesis, and I really liked those work poems, Tom. I have to tell you. And Tom kind of came in at the beginning of term. You know, thesis students supposed to work on their thesis over the year. Tom came in with 70 poems, and I was like, okay, well, we have lots to work with, and we did. I think that's kind of, you know, I think as a mentor, you're not a collaborator, but I think one of the things, I mean, I always learn a lot from the students that I work with and the students that I supervise, and I think it's made me a better poet. It's made me a better reader. In all kinds of ways, and I think one of the ways it does that is it makes you. Tom's poetry and my poetry are clearly really different, but it forces you to figure out what the other person wants to do. So I think in a way, even though I'm not writing with Tom, but I'm trying to get into the poem, what the poem needs to do for itself. So there is a type, I think, of imaginative collaboration that goes on when you're mentoring somebody, especially in that a longer term situation where you really start to get to know somebody's work. I think it's a real gift to have that.
Yeah, working with you was really great too. I learned a lot. I think you taught me a lot about these different forms, like the glosa and stuff like that. And yeah, and I think at the time, like I was just like, I think one of my main problems as a writer is that I go to this. It's too raw, it's too shocky or whatever, and then anyway, so then like you're like, okay, well this is like total overkill, like let's tone this down, and it just makes for much more interesting and complicated work, and I really appreciate that. You got me out of that mode. Yeah.
I like the idea that poetry isn't something that's what poetry isn't something that's fixed, but the work of poetry for all of us is something that is ongoing. Like we don't know what poems or poetry is. We continue to try and figure it out. Despite learning from everything in the past, it's still an ongoing project that we're all at whatever stage of our careers working in it together to figure out what we want to do, what it can do, and what it wants, as you said.
Yes, that question is, how do you know when something's finished? It's like,
I just give up.
there's nowhere to bear it anymore.
So I should cross that question off the list because it's on the list. Both of these books talk about stuff that's quite difficult, kind of traumatic experiences you've dealt with. And I was wondering if all of you could talk a little bit about how you see poetry in relationship to those kinds of experiences, what its job is, how you understand what it's doing when you're writing about those things. And maybe Gary, because you said that this book is grounded in Tom's experiences, if we need to answer that, you talk a little bit about, you said already a little bit about working alongside someone and working alongside someone else's experiences in the context of writing.
Yes, but no, absolutely. But I would also say then it causes me to think about my own experiences and how that connects. And I would also say that, I mean, it's one of the things that Tom and I have talked about is how representations of difficult things, how there's certain tropes in the language and certain ways we expect, and in what ways that they have limitations and frame things, or there's certain ways that you should talk about certain kinds of experiences and certain ways you shouldn't, supposedly. So what happens when you engage with how language works? If you're writing about something difficult, can you be funny? And there's what is your actual experience as a person experiencing trauma, difficulty, emotional crisis? There's a wide range of responses, and how does language reflect that? Like trauma writing becomes its own genre, but that may not reflect one's own sense of it, and as a living, breathing experience in the world, as someone who has experienced it, or as someone who's close to it, or someone who is an ally with it. So sometimes, as I was saying, language itself, the grammar breaks apart. Sometimes the words break apart. Like I think about the poet Paul Celan talking about using German and breaking it apart to try and represent his experiences in the Holocaust. but also the full range of how we as humans deal with things like, as I said, like with humor, like with irreverence, like with absurdity, like with reverence, like with quotation, like with diversion. There's a whole, like all the things that we do can be present in that kind of work.
I think, when I was going through breast cancer, I mean, I found it oddly comforting to read a lot of stuff by people who had had breast cancer or other kinds of cancer or other types of physical trauma and illness. I guess one of the things is that you just don't feel quite as alone in what you're dealing with. I think the other thing, and I've said, I sort of come back to this a number of times because this was a sort of a meaningful comment for me. While I was dealing with this, I was reading the London Review of Books, and they had a staff writer, columnist named Jenny Diskey, who was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer around the same time as I was dealing with my own cancer. And one of the things she said was, and she's since died, one of the things she wrote was, why write another cancer thing? There's all this cancer stuff around. And she said, well, this is what I do. I write, and this is how I know how to deal with stuff. I think it was not only a place where I could sort of process and deal with and think about what I was going through and kind of health and treatment type of contexts, but it was also eventually a place where I felt like I could talk to and connect with other people. In the session earlier, somebody asked a question about an ideal reader, and I suppose, although, I think, we've all been touched in some way by trauma and by illness, and this is not unique to me, certainly, or any of us, but feeling like I could speak to people who have gone through some of those experiences and that they would perhaps get something from what I wrote in the same way that I got something from what other people had written and what I had read during my own experience. That became a sort of meaningful project and desire for me to kind of work through and pull in.
Yeah, I think what our books do share is like that, the notion of body trauma and the fragmentary experience of the body when it's interacting with these kinds of like violent, dissociative experiences, things that we can't understand but are there anyway. Well, we can't fully understand because of how close these experiences are to our own bodies. And what I think that's great about writing about trauma, especially in with poetry, is like nobody really reads poetry, so I don't really have to worry about having people like
Best place to hide a secret. Put it in a poem, and then no one will. Yeah.
Yeah, people. Yeah. So I don't know. I've been writing poetry since I was a kid, and it's never made any money, and it never will make any money. But it's really has helped me understand myself more, and I feel like the people that would be willing to read my book may have had similar experiences to me. Might find it comforting to read it, and the fact that I use some humor. I'm trying to show that like having trauma does not necessarily define the person as being a victim or a survivor. It's just we have these things happen to us, and we learn to live with them in different ways, and there's each individual experience of trauma can be, I guess, therapized in its own unique way. And for me, I find humor helps a lot. So,
I guess the next question is it's about your poetry, but it comes out of an interview I once read with Anne Carson, where she described her office, and she said she had one desk where she did her academic work. She had another desk where she wrote poetry, and then she had a third desk where she did paintings of volcanoes, which is something she does. And I know all of you have other things that you do. Madeline, you're an academic. Tom, you're working on a PhD. You also do music. Gary, you're a novelist and a musician and a teacher and an artist. And I'm interested if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between your poetry and the other things that you do, and whether there is a relationship or not. Do you just have one desk, or do you have like many?
Yeah, like the potato chip desk, and then the whiskey desk, the coffee desk, right, yeah. The desk of unpaid bills, yeah.
Okay, I sort of tend to roam around my house when I work, so I kind of do have a fixed desk, but then I guess I also have many desks, but they don't necessarily pertain to what I'm doing. Yeah, I mean, as Aaron said, I'm also an academic. I do academic writing, and I'm always, the two are always kind of balls that I'm juggling in the air. And sometimes I spend more time writing one type of writing than I do the other type of writing, because it's very hard to write all the time, and sometimes you just need to not write anything, and you need to like read stuff or go to sleep. I mean, I think one of the things I've been finding actually in the sort of the more recent stuff I've been writing, and as I've sort of moved away from this book, is the ways in which I think that my academic work and my creative work are actually, I can see them coming closer together. My academic work is starting to think about climate change. This is something I'm sort of very interested in. There was a panel yesterday that I was talking about this. I work historically, so I read a lot of really interesting historical documents about climate and about the ways in which people thought about climate and climate events, weather events 400 years ago. And these I see as very sort of interesting, imaginative ways that I can connect my two sort of creative and academic writing worlds together. And I'm excited about that. It feels really good to be feeling a little bit more coherent, I suppose.
You know, I think I would like to have the idea that I wake up in the early morning and I listen to Gregorian chants, and then I meditate, and then and then I sit down infused with this sort of like glowing, radiant light that takes me through the day, where it might have this like focus. But it's not like that. It feels more like, and maybe this is literally true, where, you know, when you're texting multiple times at once, since you have many intersecting conversations, plus you're on Facebook, plus you can hear, you know, the dog wants to be let out, plus you're thinking about what you have. And so it's this kind of interpenetration of input. And so like the brain does have multiple processes going on at once, parallel processes. And rather than thinking of that as negative, that no, I can't attend to one thing. I mean, sometimes I do focus on one thing, but just the idea that Ezra Pound said the artist is an antenna for the race, but the idea of just being like a radio telescope ready to receive all the things around and be able to, they intersect with each other, and they connect with each other. And so that to me, it becomes a richer place of possibility, where you maybe make more turns because of various inputs that you have, and that you're constantly on your toes, being able to be aware of what the assumptions are in this particular thing that you're doing, because it's not the one way. It might be easier to be seduced by how delicious a certain kind of writing is, but if you're aware that there's all these other possibilities all the time, for me that's incredibly energizing. And it also means that much as my ego is a beautiful thing, the best ego, in fact, it takes me outside of that, and rather me as a processor, me as someone who's aware and who can then take all of what's in the world and make something out of it, respond to it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess back to the desk thing. I for sure. It's strange. I have this. My partner and I, we live at the townhouses at the university, And so I have this basement where it's like dim and it smells mildewy and I don't know, but it's kind of like, I kind of like it. It's kind of like comforting, but you know, I mean, right now I'm barely writing anything creative. I'm writing papers about Christopher Marlowe, but you know, like it's funny. There's almost like a trauma to this desk because I spent the summer writing this I was just trying to be brutally honest about my own experience as a homeless person. I mean, it's not remotely done or whatever. It doesn't matter. And then right after that, I found out that the Shark grant proposal had to be handed in like a month early, and I hadn't even started it. So I was like up until 5:30 in the morning down there at this desk, and it got to the point where I would look at the stairwell down there. Oh God!
Are you telling me that writing the grant was as traumatic as writing about your homelessness? Is that what you're actually saying?
I think it was more traumatic. Yeah. No, and I'm not kidding. I don't know what it was. It was just like I couldn't go down there. And then finally, I've been getting back and working. I think it's just sometimes it's good not to be creative or to write about these experiences. Like I find the desk is sort of resurrected from its death place, and now I can write about Tamberlane. So.
Nice. So we're coming to the end of the hour, and I have many more questions, but I'm actually kind of interested in what you guys more broadly want to say. So as my last question is, what has no one asked you yet about your work that you would like to talk about?
For me, it's just like who or what writers inspired your work.
Can you answer that question?
Yeah, I really enjoyed. My supervisor was Shane Book. I really enjoyed Congotronic. He introduced me to Will Alexander. Will Alexander is an amazing poet. Sabrina Ora Mark, she's great. Barbara Guest, John Ashbery, of course. Everybody loves John Ashbery. I hope. Anyway.
I don't know. I don't really think about what people should ask me about my work.
What would you like to say about it? You haven't had a chance to.
But I haven't had a chance to say. I guess I would say something about writing being a process, and that I think everything that we write or create is a kind of is a kind of learning and realization, and that every step of the way is necessary. Tom, the grant writing, I think everybody who writes a huge grant, is kind of like they feel ill about it at some point. But that illness is something that we have to, that sort of depression and hatred for one's work and feeling like it's just a pile of crap. You have to experience it in order to get through it and go to the other side. And I think it's a very difficult thing to learn for all of us, that in fact we have to be in the depths of misery. And it's from those depths of misery about your work, in particular, so that I'm talking about work, not just in general, but those sort of depths of misery about one's work are actually really productive and a kind of part of the process of creating for me.
Maybe for me, I would just to dovetail on that. I do a lot of collaboration, and I write in lots of different forms. And one of the things, I guess, that I think about is there's so many different ways to write, for one person to write, and writing with other people, and so that the experiences are different. They're different from time to time, and they're different with different people and different with different genres. Sometimes it's exhilarating, sometimes it's absurd, sometimes it's very depressing, sometimes it's bewildering. But there's all of these things, and sometimes all at once. You have multiple things, and the experience of working with people and just being open to the possibility of what writing can do, and what we as creative people have so many modalities with which to explore things. I mean, it's fun and satisfying and exhilarating, and we tend to think about writing, a lot of people tend to think about writing as kind of, is finding this narrower, laser-like way forward, when I think realistically it's actually, it's possible to have it be not at all like that, to be open to the full range of what's possible as you have a brain, you have access to language in so many different ways, and what can one do with that together, I think.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap this up, I just want to let everyone know that the books that you heard them read from today are for sale. Madeline Bassnett's book is for sale just up there, being vended by the UWO bookstore. And if you'd like to buy A Cemetery for Holes, it is being sold at the Gordon Hill Press table downstairs in the book fair. They're both really wonderful books. They're also wonderfully well-made books. I really like books as objects, and they're books that they're as much a pleasure to hold as they are to read. So if you liked what you heard today and like a really well-made book, please pick them up. And so I'd like to close by thanking all three of our readers today.
Thanks very much.